All Middle-earth knows the tale of the War of the Ring. But 200 years before that...
Riders of the Mark! Brothers of Rohan!
There was an older tale.
Arise!
So this is quite a self-contained story within the world of Middle-earth. It takes place 183 years before the original trilogy. You're sort of building on some quite short descriptions and things taken from appendices and things like that. So I'd love to hear a little bit about the genesis of the project, the development, and maybe what appealed to you about the story that you chose.
Yeah, it's interesting. You look at those few pages in the appendices, and initially on reading it, there's a lot left untold. Professor Tolkien actually in one of his letters wrote about saying that sometimes those are the most exciting stories, those are the most interesting stories, are the stories that have been left untold. So taking him at his word, we decided to try and tell that story. What I found when I went into those pages and really started looking at them is actually there's a wealth of story in there. And you realise that there's actually a lot of story scattered throughout the larger canon of the books. So there's actually threads of the story of Helm Hammerhand embedded in the Lord of the Rings, obviously with the Siege of Helm's Deep, etc. But the culture of the Rohirrim is very familiar to us. There's so much of that culture that we can draw upon within the books. And then in the context of the greater world, there was also some really wonderful bits of Tolkien's mythology that we could build out upon, such as the Long Winter, which is actually quite legendary within the greater story of Middle-earth, that particular time that affected not only the Rohirrim, but also actually to the north, it was affecting the hobbits in the Shire, you know, so that all of those threads of story actually gave us surprisingly a lot to draw upon. But more than that, actually, the bones of that story that's in there, that conflict, that central conflict, the unnamed daughter, was immediately intriguing, because what you understand when you look at that piece of storytelling is that, oh, wait, at the heart of this conflict, it begins with this girl and this, you know, you could say he's a usurper, this lord, this Dunlending lord coming forward and saying, you know, we should unite our peoples, my son should marry your daughter. So it begins with her, not only her father's refusal to consider this, which makes her kind of something of a pawn in the story, which is an interesting place for her character to begin. Like she has no agency over herself. What was interesting in terms of the storytelling is that you had a character, normally you would say she conquers all, as a, you know, if she was going on the hero's journey, for example, the male hero's journey, she conquers and she would become the ruler, the queen. That's not her story, though. What was interesting about this story is that she wins her freedom, which I think for young women today is actually more interesting.
Yeah.
We come with an offer to strengthen Rohan.
Héra, daughter of Helm, I, Wulf, seek your hand in marriage.
Our fathers speak as if I were not even in the room.
I do not want to marry you.
I really wanted to speak with you about
Yeah.
the role that female characters play in this film, because I thought it was so impactful. Personally, it's something I really loved about the story.
Yeah, great.
And we have not only Héra as this unnamed daughter who we get to
Yeah.
know and get to see her story, we have lore about the Shield Maidens of Rohan. We have
Yeah.
this wonderful link to the future with Éowyn as our narrator.
Yeah.
And something I really loved about that is the reflection of this being an oral history of a legend that's being passed down, and maybe less so something you're finding in the scrolls and in the texts.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about taking inspiration from real historical figures, which is something that I did read that maybe influenced your characterization.
Very much, actually. Yeah, we try to be authentic. So we delved back into, you know, some of the history of medieval women that I'm not saying that Professor Tolkien necessarily drew upon them for the character of Éowyn, who was our inspiration, by the way, for the character of Héra. But also that notion of the Shield Maidens, which would have come from some of the sagas. Some of the things that I found interesting is there is actually a really interesting tradition within historical medieval female characters, figures, who refuse to marry. And I thought that was really interesting. The notion that there were a lot, historically, an interesting kind of thread through history of women who refused to marry, who quite powerful lords came to and said, I shall take you as my bride. And they said, yeah, no, I don't think so.
No thanks. Thanks, but no thanks.
And that resistance to that. And then also what was interesting was the male reaction to that was also really interesting, which was, you know, it was a slight... It wasn't a slight against their ego as a man. It was a slight against their authority. You know, so it was actually in some instances kind of a dangerous slight to have been refused.
And I think it plays into a really interesting and textured morality in the film where,
Yeah.
you know, The Lord of the Rings is such a quintessential fantasy text and does give us a real model of, like, the traditional good versus evil story in fantasy. And this is a much more human conflict. You have flawed heroes and sympathetic villains. I'd love to hear a bit about the sort of tone you wanted to achieve with the script.
You just said the tone. That's exactly the tone that we were going for. So, yay. It sounds like we might have got there.
The boy I knew would never wish for war.
The boy you knew is gone.
Fire!
There's so many of them.
To be honest with you, I actually struggled a little bit with Héra in the beginning. And it wasn't until Phoebe, one of the young screenwriters, came on. She had a real instinct for Héra. I think she spotted the problem, and and one of the things that she really wanted to see as a young woman herself was she wanted for Héra to be able to own her fear. She didn't need to be some kind of badass, superhero. Dare I say, Xena warrior princess, which I love, by the way. Xena, I grew up on that. But that to give it a different tone. So she was allowed to fear. She was allowed to make mistakes. She was allowed to not know what to do, and because she felt that would be way more authentic character to create for young women. Speak to young women today. So although she fights, she's fighting from a place of desperation in some instances, but also defiance. You know, this is kind of being driven to a place where she understands. I love the moment in the film where she understands he will not stop. Because of her. It's because of her. He will not stop. And so therefore she comes to understand, you know what? It's gonna come down to her. But then she turns that against him. She uses it against him. His obsession for her, she uses it against him. And I loved that. I thought it was great.
People need hope, Héra. Something to believe in.
So epic, and having it unfold over the time period that it does.
Yeah.
I want to ask you as well about the style of the film, this being an animated film directed by Kenji Kamiyama. It looks incredible. I'm curious how it affects your writing process and your conceptualization, knowing that you're writing an animated film and not a live action film.
It's a really good question. It does and it doesn't. So it doesn't to the extent that, actually it's very much like writing for a live action film. A script has got to work. It's just got to work for its own sake, whatever form it's going to take. There's certain things that you can follow as a screenwriter that you've got to know that you're pulling the audience in, that there is a real story engine that's driving this, that you know where you're going first and foremost. All of those things, and where you want to deliver the audience to. So all of those threads of storytelling remain true in anime. What is different is that you really need to be on your game. There's no going back in and reshooting.
It's not very flexible.
It's not as flexible. You can't just suddenly have a great idea and reshoot. So you really need to be understand and know what your story is that you're telling. And then lastly, I think the thing that I learned is that anime is a dance, so you're not going to suddenly push in on the eyes or something like that. You're not going to get that kind of thing. So it's going to be about how the camera is moving and how, you know, how the characters are staged and framed and their interaction with each other. It's often carried by the movement of the body, not necessarily the expression on the face. And I love that. I loved learning that, oh, wow, that's how you write a line in anime, yeah.
It's such a wonderful and exciting direction. I think fantasy and animation is such a great mix, and people are going to be blown away by this film visually. With that in mind, you know, we're a cinema company. I wanted to ask you, having been with this for so long, been with Lord of the Rings for so long now, what does it mean to you and how does it feel to have it back on the cinema screen?
I'm so excited. Can I tell you, genuinely, actually not for myself, because I think actually the other talents that were brought to bear on this, the world is going to meet them. You know, we've got a beautiful score by Stephen Gallagher. You know, I think the script is beautiful. Phoebe and Artie did a great job there. But Kenji Kamiyama, for Western audiences especially, to truly understand, I think the guy is a genius. Absolutely. I'm terrified live action is going to steal him away. But I hope we get to make another film with him because he's masterful.
I hope so too.
Okay.
Congratulations on the film. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What does Mordor want with rings?
Thank you for watching Picturehouse Cinema's unique video content. Hit the subscribe button to be kept up to date with our movie news, cast and crew interviews, highlights, trailers, and lots more.